Good morning, everyone. I am so happy to be here today. First time in Hong Kong. Thank you so much for having me. This isn't going down. Yep, it is. Let's start. Thank you, Timo, for this wonderful introduction about HDR. From an Apple point of view, HDR is really, really important because the HDR images represent a larger range of light intensity and a larger gamut, and it provides a better user experience with more beautiful images. On iPhone, trillions of images are captured as HDR every year by Apple users, and most of displays are transitioning to HDR. When you compare HDR displays with SDR displays, they offer a dynamic range that is far greater than traditional CRT devices or even LCD displays. If you look at this from the dynamic range point of view, when you compare the HDR display on the top with the SDR displays on the bottom, you'll see deeper blacks on an HDR display. You'll see a higher range on the bright side with a peak value that goes far above the peak value of an SDR display. So now when we capture a photo on an HDR camera, from the same pixel values, from the same photons, we can choose to optimize for an HDR display or for an SDR display. Of course, traditionally, the industry has been optimizing for SDR displays on the bottom. So all the photos you've taken in the last 20 years with your digital cameras have adopted things like sRGB or Adobe P3 or other color encoding that are SDR based, and they've optimized for SDR displays. With this new technology, HDR, becoming more and more available on display, there's a growing benefit in optimizing images for HDR displays. And again, from the same photons, you can choose to optimize for HDR or for SDR. In these photos we shot at Apple to exhibit some of the benefits of HDR technology, we have this reference white or this diffuse white that you're very familiar with, represented here by either the book or the coffee cup. As you can see, this white in that image is similar to the white of the background window. Essentially, when optimizing for SDR, all the white values, whether they are diffuse white or light sources, they're going to be rendered roughly at the same level. Now, when you transition to HDR, and of course this is just a simulation because we're not actually using an HDR display here. When you optimize for HDR, things are going to be done slightly differently. And suddenly, the window in the back appears brighter than the reference white of the book and the cup. So we're using the dynamic range to show larger differences between emitting light and diffuse surfaces in the image. When it comes to storing HDR images, it all started on the video side. The work was done by people like Dolby, represented by Timo, in an international context, ITUR, and also in SMPTE. These are the two standardization organizations that standardized what we now know as HDR video. You may have heard about HDR10+, HDR10, Dolby Vision, HDR Vivid. These are different formats that are leveraging all this work done by these standardization bodies, where videos are now defined as encoded either using the PQ, perceptual concentration curve, on the left, or the HLG, hybrid log gamma curve, on the right. These are, in essence, the two transfer curves that are used by HDR videos nowadays. In addition to the color encoding curve, the industry is using a wide color gamut encoding known as BT2020. So most of the HDR videos out there are encoded using these more saturated primaries. And of course, this is far exceeding the SDR gamut such as sRGB, and it's also exceeding the gamut of a typical printer. like I mentioned, this HDR standardization effort started in video. At Apple, when we transitioned to HDR displays, we thought, how are we going to encode HDR photos? There's no standard out there for us to encode HDR photos as HDR. So Paul Hubel, who's with us today, and I decided to start the work in ISO TC42. It's a technical committee focusing on digital photography. We wanted to reuse all the work done by HDR video standards, try to encode images similarly using PQ or HLG, using the same BT2020 gamut, and so on. This was published as 22028-5, so you can go online today and order that standard. It defines how to store a photo using 10-bit PQ or HLG, BT2020. It also defines reference display. It's an HDR display, obviously, with a default peak of 1,000 nits and a reference white of 203 nits. It also defines a reference viewing environment. For all of you in the printing industry, I'm sure you fully understand why we need a reference environment. If you show it an HDR display in a very dark environment versus outside, you're going to get different looks, different perception of the image. So we need to define both the HDR display and its environment. Comparing this new ISO HDR encoding with the typical sRGB, you see the blacks are way deeper in HDR than in SDR. And you also see the peak value now, which is 1,000 nits compared to what was typically 80 nits for sRGB when it was first defined. But as you probably know today, if an sRGB display goes a little bit higher than 80, it typically goes to 160, and depending on conditions, it can be higher if you go outside. Okay, so this is how these two worlds compare, HDR versus SDR. In the HDR specification, we also included a lot of metadata that can be used at display time or at printing time, and Luke Wallis will cover this more in the next presentation. Now, as a photographer, we can choose to render and optimize for an HDR display, and using metadata, we can still do a decent job showing this image on an SDR display. And of course, for this industry here, what you probably want to know is, can we print this? And the answer is yes. Obviously, we can print them using the same kind of metadata. We can adapt an HDR photo to make a decent job on an SDR printer. And one aspect of this is tone mapping. A printer has typically a reduced dynamic range compared to an HDR display. So one way to handle this is to apply a tone mapping operator, and this is a default tone mapping operator that is being standardized in the next edition of 22028-5. This tone mapping operator is a very default, very optimized for the greater good, optimized for all images out there. It's not image dependent, so it's a static tone mapper. It is already implemented in macOS and iOS on our system. So if you open an HDR photo today on your iPhone, this is the tone mapping operator we would use when you are in a condition that doesn't have all the headroom required. This is also something that is supported by other industry players such as Google. It's not published yet, but it will be published very soon, and it can be used for printing. I've mentioned a few times that the peak of an HDR display is higher than an SDR display. And if you look at this range between the two peaks here, we call this headroom, HDR headroom. And it's defined very simply as the ratio of the peak in HDR and the peak of the SDR part, the reference white here. And if you take the log of this ratio, you can now think about this in terms of stops. 1 stop, 2 stop, 3 stops of headroom. The concept of stops come from the photography industry. When you close your lens, 1 stop, 2 stops, 3 stops. So it's using the same, thank you. It's using the same references. And now, when opening an HDR file for a given system, you'll have this file that has this content headroom, and of course it's file specific, so each photo will use more or less HDR headroom. And on the right side, you have your display or your printer that has also a given headroom. If you open this photo in a recent image player or image editing software, such as an Adobe software, you will see the histogram represented as HDR. And you will see that in this particular image, content goes above the HDR peak into the HDR range, the HDR headroom range. And if your display has sufficient headroom, you don't need to do anything at display time. You just show your image as is. And if you had an HDR printer, you'd be in a similar situation. You would not need to do anything about this image in terms of headroom management or tone mapping. But if your display has a reduced headroom, and maybe that's because you've taken your laptop outside and we had to change the way we display things, and now you have less headroom available, now you need to do some tone mapping to avoid clipping. And this is a typical representation of a soft clipping curve, such as the one I showed you earlier for the ISO 22 or 28-5. Okay, so now we've established a few things. We can save a photo as an HDR photo, and using metadata, using tone mapping algorithms, we can adapt to the headroom available on the device at pre-production time. The device may be a display or a printer. There's one more thing that I would like to introduce. It's the concept of gain map. This concept of gain map was introduced at Apple by Garrett Johnson and Paul Hubel. They're both with us today if you want to talk to them during the break. And this is a new metadata that is stored in a photo, and that helps us handle the different situations with more or less headroom. So now we've transitioned with this technology, from global curves to local curves. The way we generate these game maps is at capture time from the same camera information. We render for SDR on the top. We also rendered for HDR on the bottom. And we can compute the ratio between those two images, and that's what we call the gain map. This is a new kind of metadata stored in the file. And at display time, we can either use the SDR image and display it as is or print it as is, or we can reconstruct an HDR file by combining the gain map with the HDR image to build an HDR photo represented here. And that HDR photo can be displayed on an HDR display, or it can be printed on an HDR printer if you have that. So this gives you maximal flexibility. You can handle any output media out there, printers, displays with more or less headroom, more or less dynamic range. We will show you a demo during the coffee break of an HDR print on the right here. Eric Wadowit and Paul Hubel will be around with me and others to show you this bleeding technology. This was first introduced at the Color and Imaging Conference a week ago here in Hong Kong. This is work done in Germany by a research lab. So talk to us during the break if you want to hear more about how to print an HDR photo as HDR. This game map technology, first introduced by Apple in Apple iPhones, is now an ISO standard. So this was published over the summer. It's called 21496-1. It defines very simply how to store a gain map in a file, how to store the metadata that should be used at display time or at printing time. It's available on the web, you can buy it. It's shipping in iOS, in macOS, it's fully supported. We've been doing this for about 2 years in iPhone now. And it's also actually adopted by the rest of the industry. So this is just a snapshot of how far it's been adopted by the industry at this stage. So if you look at most of the flagship cameras from Japan, like Canon, Sony, and Nikon, they support HDR. They store images as HDR using the first standard I mentioned earlier, 22 or 28-5. Hasselblad just introduced a full, medium format, sorry, not full frame, but more than full frame, a high quality HDR camera that stores images as HDR and show you the images as HDR on the in the viewfinder and on the back display. As I mentioned, Apple supports this in macOS and iOS. Google also supports this on Android and Chrome. It's been adopted by Android smartphones as well, such as all the flagship Chinese smartphones, Huawei, Vivo, Oppo. They all support gain maps and HDR technology. And online social media also adopt HDR technology. So if you share an HDR photo on Instagram, it shows up as HDR. And we are working with Chinese social media such as RedNote and so on to also help them adopt all these standards. So that means most of the users today are likely to shoot HDR, share HDR images online, and we want to make sure we are ready to print these images when they come in printing workflows. Thank you very much. This was my last slide. Thank you.